So the next series of talks that we're going to have the rest of this morning is a series of talks that probably just 3 years ago we actually would not have had. And while I am really, really glad to have our Australian colleagues join us here as part of this restoration community, it was a community they certainly didn't want to be part of just 3 or 4 years ago. And unfortunately, they have had a situation that has required them to have to join this community. For those of you that were at the ICRS when we were in Australia, and this is not a dig to any of my Australian colleagues, Australia restoration wasn't a main topic of conversation, right? So when we were there in 2012, the restoration sessions were a mile from the main venue, shoved in a small room, and basically, because they didn't need it. They were taking the approach that we all wanted to take, which is that conservation and stewardship was what was necessary for our reefs. And they have very unfortunately had a tragic situation happen on their reefs over the course of the last 3 years, losing 50% of the live coral cover on the Great Barrier Reefs. That has brought them to a situation where they've realized that restoration is one part of a multifaceted solution. And so that right there, and in 2 short years, they have jump-started an amazing race to find a new solution, to upscale restoration, to think really, really big. What has taken us as a community, no dig on us, 10, 15 years to kind of find our ground, find our course, they have rapidly put together, as they've put together this consortium through the Australian Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. It's a consortium of university partners, government partners, and private sector to really start to think about how they are going to restore the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is nearly 1,800 miles long. As I mentioned yesterday, it's going to take a lot more than divers and baskets of corals to solve that problem. They are thinking big. They are thinking next gen. They are thinking everything from how do we put corals back out into that reef to how do we make a situation where we might not even need to do reef restoration because we can change the climate conditions on the individual reef itself. And so the leader of that effort is David Mead with the Australian Institute of Marine Science, where David serves as the Executive Director for Strategic Development and coordinates this massive effort of RRAP. David's an engineer by training, so can kind of try to keep his scientific colleagues in check a little bit and keep them focused on that project plan and that project goal, and the results of that are something you're going to see today here. They've made a tremendous progress, and they are also, the Australian government's also making great investments in this space as well, which are going to serve to benefit those of us all around the world. So, David?
So thanks, Tom. I feel I almost don't need to give this talk now. Where are we? So I am an engineer. I have very little background in reef restoration. I'm not a marine biologist, and yet I'm leading a program. So wish me good luck. I don't need to tell this audience about the Great Barrier Reef. But I do want to touch on a few points. The Great Barrier Reef is just a core part of the Australian culture. We have Aboriginal and Indigenous Australian storylines that go back 20,000 years, pre the flooding of that whole area as the Australian landmass was greater, before the shelf got flooded. So it's part of our culture. It's one of the 7 wonders of the world. It's a big driver of the Australian economy. And of course, it's a movie star. It sits inside a well-managed, multi-use marine national park. The Australian government set up the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority many, many, many years ago to manage that system. And I think we've had hundreds of people managing that system, putting management plans in place, MPAs, and all sorts of things through time. And yet it's still struggling. People have talked a bit about this over the last couple of days. 51% coral cover decline between 1985 and 2012. Cyclones, that was the 5 years leading into 2012 of Category 4 and above. So the system gets hit regularly and frequently by large cyclone systems. Crown of thorn starfish outbreaks, the second driver of that mortality, and coral bleaching. But of course, it was in the last couple of years where we had 2 back-to-back mass bleaching events where we lost a further 50%. And the question is, throughout that time, the system was still resilient. It was still recovering after each event. The question is, what resilience is now left in the system? And the northern GBR, so the section above Cairns, provides an illustration of this. That was a part of the Great Barrier Reef that had been fairly stable for the last 15 years. It was bouncing around a bit. It hadn't been seeing some of those cyclones and COTS outbreaks. But then again, in the last 2 years, it didn't really matter. It bleached heavily and went down at 10%. Of course, all of that is at +1. We know that the future isn't +1. What will the future be? We don't really. Well, your guess is as good as mine, but what is it, a 2-3% chance of achieving Paris? So I put that in the unlikely bucket, unfortunately. And so this program really did start with the question, what else can we do? Can we work the resilience still present in the system? I agree, that is a bit of an odd photo, as people keep pointing out to me. It doesn't normally work that way around. Can we develop new management interventions? And so that was the genesis of the Restoration and Adaptation Program. And we set ourselves 3 core goals. Can we protect key ecological functions, economic and social values of the Great Barrier Reef? Can we develop techniques that are logistically feasible to deploy at scale? And can we do this at a price point that's affordable to deploy them at scale? And one of the things that I'll talk a bit more about in the second talk I give today, you're going to have to listen to me twice, sorry, is that price and scaling don't necessarily go hand in hand. Low cost per unit does not necessarily mean scalability. And so 3 key words there: values, scale, and affordable. So this program wasn't set up to do all things reef restoration in the Australian context. This program has been set up to very specifically look at, can we bring a set of new tools to the system that can be deployed if required, and enable us to meet some of the challenges going forward. And so we knew at the outset that many of these things would take quite a number of years to develop. So we're attempting to get ahead of the curve. Of course, we're already starting behind the 8 ball. And so that was the genesis of this program. And of course, it's not an easy challenge. It's a large system. Tom just pointed out how long. 3,000 reefs, hundreds of billions of corals, 600 species. It's complex. Complex in an ecology perspective, complex in its connectivity to the landmass and the development and other things that have been occurring in that space. It's remote. Why would I say that? It's right next to the coastline. In fact, when you're thinking about doing things in the Great Barrier Reef, often it's 50 to 200 or 300 miles, I'm talking US, from the nearest port. We don't have, most Australians live on the coastline. There's still relatively few people on that coastline. We're a very sparse population, and most of the time when you're out on the Great Barrier Reef, you can't see the land. There's no adjacent community to work on that area. And so when we're thinking about what we're going to do in this space, we have to recognise that we're going to be working remotely. Diverse stakeholders and values, I mentioned that at the start. We've got people that have 10, 20,000 years of history, cultural, social values tied up in that system, right the way through to people whose direct livelihoods rely on a tourism industry or a fishing activity. It's a tough ask to think about doing something in this space when you know that you're going to be trading values. You're going to be trading off between people's value sets. And of course we have uncertain future conditions. Climate, political. Will we achieve Paris or not? Doubly complex in that our goals are fairly audacious, I guess you could say. When you break it down, an intervention is it's an action or product that you deploy in a specific location. So you go in and you do something at a particular point in time, at a scale, and if you do it well, you get a local restoration benefit. Yet what we're targeting is a system benefit, at a restoration level or ideally to achieve adaptation and resilience benefits. In the previous discussion, there was a conversation about novel ecosystems. Can you guide the system to a novel state that's perhaps better than the one it was going to land at in itself? Can you do things that effectively you want to do yourself out of a job? The system's too large to set up a process where we are there forever trying to hold it in a particular state. That's just not going to work in a system that's as large as the Great Barrier Reef. So what can we do at a local level that has a benefit at a system level? And as Tom indicated, it's been a bit of a long, slow process, but the government's come on board and we've got some funding. We formed a partnership. This is much bigger than any one organisation. There was originally 7 core partners over the course of the last 12 months. That's grown to about 20 different partners, including some relationships with organisations like Secor in the US. We're new to this game. We're having an absolute attempt to think about how we can step out and do things at scale. Nevertheless, there's an awful lot of expertise globally in this area that we know that we need to leverage off. And a lot of it's sitting in this room, which makes it a bit tough for me to come and stand here because I know I'm talking to a bunch of people that know a lot more about the subject than I do. Nevertheless, I'm not a half-bad engineer, I guess, and I can run a program. So, we set ourselves, it's a big task, and so we've been running through a scoping phase over the last 12 months. And the federal government came on board in February and funded that to the tune of $6 million. And you go, that's a lot of money for a scoping study. It's a big challenge. And it was really to, over the last 12 months, to go, is it needed? What might be possible? What's the investment case going forward? And how do we approach the next phase? I'd been going into Canberra and talking about hundreds of millions needing to be invested in R&D and probably billions in restoration activities. Trying to change the paradigm of thinking a little bit in the Australian context that a system that large, you cannot expect to make a big change to it by spending $10. And in fact, in April, the government announced a further $100 million to kickstart the R&D phase of this program. So we're making progress, at least funding-wise. I just want to go through a little bit about the program structure because after morning tea, we've got some speakers that are going to go into some of the details in these areas, and this will make sense a bit more. So we've got sort of 4 major threads of activities we've been looking at this year. A big stakeholder engagement program. If we don't bring stakeholders along, we're never going to get political agreement to do these things and regulatory approval. We need to run a co-design process. The regulatory context within Australia, well, you simply can't do these things at the moment. So how are you going to shift that? How are we going to partner? There's a bunch of activities around interventions, identification, technology readiness, risk, development needs. Run an extensive process trying to gather what people are doing elsewhere and some first principles thinking about new ideas. A whole group that's been looking at scaling and deployment, and I'll talk a bit more about that after morning tea. But taking those and going, okay, would that one scale out potentially? If so, what would be required? What might it cost? How long might that take? Some first principles assessments. And then system modelling. Been attempting to model the system into the future. What's the counterfactual? What might the Great Barrier Reef do going forward under different climate scenarios and different traditional management options? And then can we overlay that with some hypothetical interventions to understand things like, well, if I do this type at this scale, what might the benefit be? Or if I do combinations. Again, very early phase sort of things, but to get a bit of an understanding, I guess, as to how these things might come together. And we've been rolling that around and doing the kind of the classic risk-benefit cost type analysis. And out of that will pop a number of findings and recommendations in an R&D strategy going forward. And so at this point, I need to put a slight caveat. We're not quite finished. We signed up to do this conference, we thought we'd be done by now, but we decided to extend this phase because it's quite challenging. So there's still a bunch of work in progress, and we also haven't reported some of the findings back to the people that are funding this, and they like to hear about it firsthand, not from a conference in the US. Nevertheless, I do want to go through 4 interim findings, just to set the scene a little bit for after morning tea. Climate mitigation and cost management are critical. And you go, oh, tell me something you don't know. That's self-evident, David. In fact, we still need to put more pressure on policymakers for climate change. And at the moment, you have people that go, oh no, the system, it's just had a big natural selection process, it will recover through time, just let it happen. Through to those that are saying, no, it's dead already, which it isn't actually. I should have said that at the start. It's battered and bruised, it's not dead, it's worth coming for a visit. And so it's really important that we can put some more quantitative information on the table about what might happen to that system under different future states. And for us, it's also important to see, well, what types of interventions might be needed under different future states, what might not work. Where's the point where it doesn't matter what you do, you're really going to have very little impact. And we need that to send that to policymakers just to keep putting pressure on. It was interesting, we've been undertaking quite a lot of stakeholder engagement things. One of the things that we did was we went out and surveyed several thousand people, and we gave them little case examples of an intervention technique and said, what do you think of this idea? Would you support something like this? Are you worried about it? And this is just one example. It's surface shading with micro surface films. And anything to the left of the red bar is kind of, don't really like the idea. To the right, actually, no, I'm willing to consider this. Want more information, but yep, we think that we need to start thinking about these sort of things. And we went out and surveyed a whole bunch of ideas, and it was overwhelmingly supportive. They're a bit worried about certain things. Australia has a history of poorly introduced non-native species. I probably don't need to say anything more. Many possible interventions and combinations are essential. It's another early conclusion. Because we've got so many things that we've identified, we've split them into 2 categories and 7 types. And I do want to introduce this because we'll set the scene for a bit later. So we have 3 clusters of intervention types that we've been exploring that kind of sit under the recovery side of things. So biocontrols, lots of different methods there, algae removal, predation, herbivorous management type things. Reproduction recruitment, the classic restoration, reseed corals that are in a degraded state, and rubble stabilisation and 3D structure. Rubble hasn't traditionally been a problem in the GBR. It forms, of course, when there's cyclones, and obviously there's a cyclone track, but at a macro kind of ecology level, not such of an issue. However, the question is, what happens to all these large bleached areas? And if that keeps continuing, do we have more of an ecosystem rubble issue? And if so, what could we do about that? So we've been exploring lots of ideas with industry about large-scale rubble stabilisation. And then a category of interventions that are more about prevention. So there's a category there about shading and cooling, from large-scale geoengineering ideas to point source ideas, and Dan will talk a bit more about those. Probiotics and enhanced bleaching survival. Can we treat corals that are bleaching and help them survive? It's a bit of an odd one. Lots of things that you might do. No delivery mechanism. You can't spray the reef. So it's kind of in the out there category. But, it's a no stone unturned approach we're taking here. And then a couple of categories of what you might classify as hardy corals. Can you work with the natural genetics in the system and use assisted adaptation techniques, or all the way through to the the genetic and synthetic biology methods? So 7 categories. Underpinning that, there's about 25 methods we've been assessing and about 50 different delivery techniques. So we've been running this kind of process to understand what might be possible. We haven't been doing R&D on them, we've just been doing assessment work on these. This was a graph that we drew right at the start. It was a kind of a hypothetical proposition, and that was, will these things build upon each other? Can I get a better benefit if I kind of stack my interventions up? So this is a graph where on the vertical axis it's just a hypothetical reef state, time on the other axis, the counterfactual is that that system's declining. And if I start stacking up my interventions and doing more than one at the same time, do I get a better benefit? And we're absolutely seeing that in the modelling. Modelling's modelling, as you know. It can be rubbish in, rubbish out. Sorry, it can. Nevertheless, I don't believe that's the modelling we're doing at the moment. And so what we're seeing is a definite correlation between things. In fact, some things not working unless you get the other thing right. And so that's another area that we're exploring at a system kind of ecology level. It'll be something we'll work on for many more years yet before we really truly know and understand this stuff, but that's a space. And then economics. I don't expect people to study this graph, but we are looking at the cost, the hard-nosed cost-benefit of doing this sort of stuff. And in fact, this is a graph of, on the top, above the red line is the benefits of doing an intervention, costed into dollars, and on the below the line is the costs, and the blue line would be the net. This is a present value discounted cash flow analysis. Over a bunch of kind of expected benefits, expected cost outcomes. And of course, there's also, if I put the variability into this and all that sort of stuff, you can push this blue line way into the positive, and you can have scenarios that are negative still. So we have a lot of uncertainty sitting in this. But why do you do this? Aren't coral reefs too valuable to think about in terms of money? Well, sooner or later you've got to get funding. You're going to need money to do this sort of stuff if you're thinking about something the size of the GBR. We need to convince the Treasurer of Australia that this is an investment, not just the people. Really do need to understand that this touches a different demographic, I guess, of people. It helps us go through and go, well, where might be the best bang for buck? And so we've been doing that. Finally, high uncertainty. Self-explanatory, I guess. We still have a lot of uncertainty in the work that we've been doing. This analysis we've undertaken over the last 12 months has really highlighted the shortfalls that we have in kind of fundamental knowledge. Trying to forecast a system out as far into the future as we were brought all sorts of questions about adaptation and heritability and genetics and things that pass through and don't, and trade-offs and all this sort of stuff that in reality we know very little about. So it really has focused us and gone, okay, well, if we're going to manage this, we're going to have to start understanding these things. Intervention technique, delivery, can we develop these things? And then if we can develop them, will they perform as we expect? And of course the costing, and so extensive R&D is required. So where next for us? Well, we'll publish findings kind of early next year, transition to the next phase, and we need to keep growing the international partnerships that we've started. And part of sponsoring this conference and being here is to let you know what you're doing and get some other engagement. Final slide. Hey, look, there's a number up there. I've only found one of my people so far. So this was meant to remind me to talk a bit about moonshots. I don't see this. We started talking about this program as a moonshot, but in fact, when this program was announced, the Australian government announced a thing called national missions. I'll let you read it. Large-scale initiatives catalysed by the government to address audacious challenges, to accelerate innovation, etc., etc. So this program was announced on the same day as, the RRAP program was announced on the same day as the concept of national missions, and the RRAP program is being seen by the Australian government as a national mission. It's one of 2 or 3 that they're going to be focused on going forward. That's an incredibly positive signal. Can't overstate that. We need to get policymakers behind these types of efforts, and this is what we're doing. And so finally, I'm presenting this on behalf of 60 or 70 different core people in this team. I'd like to thank them. And I thank you for your time, and I'll see you after morning tea. Thanks.